As an Eagle Scout, Dan Coberly is an award-winning leader, author, historian, journalist, and strategic media consultant. His company, C Communications, was a pioneer in the field of reputation management. He has a long history with the U.S. military, where he was assigned to stations around the globe in his work with public affairs and journalism. He's authored several books, including his novel, Man on the Floor, which was considered in first-round selections for a Pulitzer Prize in 2018. He's received multiple honors through his life, including the Distinguished Eagle Scout and Silver Buffalo Awards, and serves as the Vice President for Communications and Marketing for the National Eagle Scout Association. Hey Dan, thanks for joining us today. You have a rather unique background in scouting as both a youth and an adult. And I'm wondering if you could lay the groundwork for this conversation we'll have here today by talking a little bit about what makes your background as a youth and adult growing up particularly unique, that a lot of people that will be watching this won't have experienced themselves.
I represent the subculture of military brats and military and American expatriates who live overseas. I grew up in a military family. We were stationed in the Panama Canal Zone, where I started Boy Scouting. And from there, we went to the States briefly while my dad was in Vietnam. And then we went to Europe, where I became an Eagle Scout in the Transatlantic Council. What's unique about all that is, living in overseas countries, the Boy Scouts of America brings a bit of America, a taste of home, away from home. And it was a great thing for me because there weren't a whole lot of other options. There were sports in high school, some youth activity and church activities, but not the wide variety of things that you have here. We didn't even have American television when I was over there in the particular place where I was located. As an adult, I was in the military myself and as a federal employee, and spent a good 27 some years overseas, mostly in Asia and Europe. Places like Italy and Belgium, Germany, France, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, places like that. And everywhere I went, you had instant friends, whether you were a youth or an adult, because of Boy Scout programs. That makes it very, very unique in terms of the type of scouting experiences that you have. For example, having a vigil ceremony on Mount Fuji while the sun comes up in the background, or we did a vigil ceremony once in the Philippines where the Moro Indians were chanting in the background. And the guy thought it was part of the ceremony, but it was actually Easter. And they had some kind of ritual going on in the jungle. It just coincided with our ceremony. And then, we had our high school events in castles. We camped in castles. We hiked between castles. Just an array of very cool experiences as a youth and an adult.
Yeah. Would you say you had some experiences that were unique as you were moving through on your trail to Eagle, or some challenges that people in the States might not face? Or do you think it was pretty much the same experience?
Well, having been a scout leader in the United States, yeah, I'd say it's very different. One of the things is when you live in a foreign country, you have a lot of restrictions on what you can do for an Eagle project, for example. In Germany, you can't just cut down a tree. The forest meisters kind of frown on that. And on a military base, you're also limited on what you can do because the military kind of frowns on interfering with their base. So you've got to have a lot more coordination and approvals. And the kinds of projects you do are somewhat limited. I mean, you're generally not going to do a drug drive to get old medicines and things like that without the base commander behind you and that sort of thing. So you're kind of limited to projects because the military does a lot of their own repair projects. And so if you want to rebuild the meeting place for the chapel, well, that's going to be done by the military, not you. My particular project was 3 months replanting trees and shrubs around a major military hospital and getting rid of all of the overgrowth on cobblestones using rock salt water, and an old Indian pump behind a Jeep. A guy drove a Jeep while I sprayed the salt water on the cobblestones. And that was the most environmentally friendly thing we could do back in those days. The same thing with the camps, you're very limited on the types of things you can do at camp. because you don't really own the property. The government doesn't own the property. Usually, we're on uh, a place that's been granted for our use. Sometimes it belongs to the foreign scouts themselves, and just a lot of rules and regulations that you don't face here. And we have enough of those in the United States.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, just a little offside, and it just hit me. Given the large representation of military folks in this, do you find that the ceremonies involved with scouting, courts of honor and the like, are a little bit more formal than they are here in the States? Just following a bit more military tradition? I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. When I was in Panama, there was, everything was sponsored by special forces. And so we didn't have a lot of scout equipment. For one reason, there wasn't a whole lot available in the one place you could buy it, which was the PX store at the Cocosolo facility. Back in those days, the military base exchanges were the distributors for uniforms and insignia. There wasn't a scout store like you have in councils now in Panama. Um, because the military kind of ran things, most of our equipment was military. So we had, canteens and mosquito nets, and all our tents for the most part were military. That wasn't always true as I got older. I mean, we had Baker tents, things like that. In Europe, it was somewhat different because they did have a scout store when I was a child in Heidelberg. But when you had 42 countries in your council and one scout store, a lot of stuff had to be done by mail. And in those days, there wasn't a lot of things done by airmail. Most things were sent by ship. So if you ordered an Eagle kit and it came from New York or wherever the scout office was in New Jersey, it came by ship. And so that was a constant thing of getting items late, patches late, things like that. And there weren't a lot of patches. There wasn't the proliferation of things that you see today. Um, but it took quite a while to get a tent ordered, for example, and shipped from the States to here. So you tended to rely on military equipment, which was usually excess stuff. Um, and that said, we had an awful lot of that, and nobody ever went without anything. Um, and most kids had maybe one uniform that they got for Christmas or something. Uh, the formality of courts of honors and all that, yeah, I think it was pretty structured, very formal. I was very impressed by the way things were organized and the way the ceremonies were done. Um, but my frame of reference is instant recognition, which was the original plan for recognition. Is you got your badge right away and you got your paperwork at the court of honor. Okay,
Ah,
except for your eagle, which was presented and pinned on and all that. But back in those days, because the stuff took so long to get there, unless the
yeah.
troop had a lot of money, which fortunately most of our troops did because we had some unique abilities to raise money through the annual carnival. They had a youth carnival every year.
Oh,
And we made, I think the AYA, which was the Area Youth Activity, sold ice cream and made $35,000 selling ice cream to the Germans because they don't have the same kind of ice cream that we have. So that was a
all
big money
right.
maker. We also
I
sold,
guess so.
when I was in the Letterman's Club, I was the vice president of the Letterman's Club. We sold sloppy joes and we made like $10,000 selling sloppy
Wow.
joes.
Wow.
And this was at a big carnival, with German rides and all that kind of stuff. But it was a German American carnival. And most of our money came from that or from the Wives Club and the youth activities program.
Yeah.
So we didn't have a lot of concerns about money, I'd say, for the kinds of things that challenges that face people here in the United States
Yeah.
because the military
Money.
took good care of us and we had those opportunities.
Money is always a challenge at the unit level here in the States.
Yeah.
Because of the close association with military and knowing the frequency that military folks are moved from place to place, was it difficult maintaining stability and sustainability at the troop level or the unit level because of the inflow and outflow of adult leadership?
Yes and no. Yes, when I was in Panama, the turnover was sort of high because special forces individuals or units were always going off on missions. Like my dad would kiss me good morning and be gone for 6 months, and I didn't know where he was or what he was doing. But the special forces units were very good about taking care of your family. So you had a sponsor who was assigned to your family, and they helped take care of anything you needed. while your dad was gone. They even checked to make sure you did your homework and stuff. So, you know, it was it was a really amazing thing. Later in Europe and as an adult, there was a little more stability. There were a lot more people, of course, in Europe than there were in Panama. At that time, there was something like 50,000 dependents in Germany alone, and now there's probably that few troops because so many bases have been closed. So in terms of stability, there was interestingly a huge amount of draftees who were Eagle Scouts or Airmen or Scouts who wanted to get involved in scouting, and so you had no shortage of people willing to be scout leaders. And yeah, I've been in commands, you know, where the general, the aide, the driver, everybody was an Eagle Scout. Um, I'm not saying it was a mafia or anything, but it was um, a place that they knew you had some common ground and you had some background and expertise. And the standard for you was higher than for others because you were expected to behave and conform in a certain way. Um, I think the good news is with the rapid turnover, because most people are on a 3 or 4 year tour in the military, there's always an opportunity for someone to do something. So for me as a kid, you know, moving to a new base, there was first thing you did was find a scout troop, and you made instant friends, and you had a network of people. And as an adult, it was the same. I could parachute into Japan, and next thing you know, I'm at a camporee or I'm on a woodbatch staff because they needed you. That kind of turnover is good in my view. In the United States, it's a lot more static. And at times, you know, everything's situational depending on where you are and what time you're looking at. Um, but I think sometimes in the United States, people can be in one position too long, and that discourages other people because they don't get the same opportunities. If you don't have a legacy plan in a military or they're not military councils, they're overseas councils, and there are, you know, expatriates from embassies, and there are American corporations and companies overseas. There's American schools. There's missionaries. I had a guy on my woodbed staff in Japan. His name was James Bond, and he was a radio missionary in the Philippines. And I wrote about that in the Stars and Stripes when I was a reporter. But it was a pretty cool story. But you meet all kinds of interesting people. I met a guy who runs a Coast Guard cutter in Tokyo, and I had no idea the Coast Guard was even in Tokyo. I met people that were the head of the Republicans abroad in Taiwan. I think I told you before I went to Taiwan, and
Yeah.
I'd never seen so many Cub packs in my life. I had no idea there were that many Cub packs.
Yeah,
In Europe, go ahead.
in that conversation about the number of Cub packs, we kind of drifted into, and you mentioned it earlier today, talking about the relatively low number of options that youth had back then, and even probably today, if it wasn't school related or the like. So scouting can really fill a huge void that otherwise youth might experience. Um, does the military? I don't know if you can talk for the military, but did they embrace the idea of females being allowed into traditional Boy Scouting? Because
Yeah.
it
Well, I think
really,
again, you know, the overseas councils were generally started at the end of World War II. Most of them. That's not true. There was actually a council in Peking, China, in the 20s. That's a whole nother conversation. But the Far East Council and the Canal Zone Council and the Transatlantic Council were basically started in the 50s, and it became, you know, councils by invitation of the Boy Scouts of America that were invited by the military. But so were, you know, the Red Cross and other organizations were also invited. Um, and as they grew and as the U.S. forces got more position, there were more civilians or school teachers and, you know, contractors, federal employees, and of course embassies and others. So um, you ended up with a lot more Americans than you might expect at that time during the Cold War. There aren't as many, at least not in Europe, as there were when I was a kid. But with the demise of the Direct Service Council, a lot more country territories have been picked up. So I'm digressing a little bit, but what I wanted to say was in Europe, you have a landmass and some distance uh, involved but Central Europe, is like New England. You can drive to another country in a couple hours. Um, and in Asia, the Pacific Rim is at that time were 9 countries in the 9 districts that were countries. And so travel in Asia had to be by boat or by ship or airplane, and in Europe it was by train or car or by rail. So it was very different in terms of the logistics, in my opinion. I don't know if that answered your question.
We're just having a conversation, but I do have an additional question I'd like to put to you because you're with you're with NISA, pardon me, his vice president for communications and marketing. Could you talk a little bit about NISA? And what I'd like to do is invite you back in the future. We can talk a lot more in depth, but just for viewers who may not know much about NISA, could you give a little plug for the organization?
Sure. NISA is a great alumni group. In fact, it is the flagship alumni group of the Boy Scouts of America. There are other alumni groups like the Philmont Scout Association and others, but this one is purely comprised of Eagle Scouts. And I think it can be it's not a fraternity per se, it is a organization that should be providing service at the council level. Every council should have an active NISA committee, and those committees should be providing service that supports the council. And that service involves manpower, logistics, and support. And so if the council wants to host a NISA dinner or breakfast or whatever, raise some funds, that's great. But generally speaking, we need leaders, and Eagle Scouts are our main product in terms of the ideal scout. And so we should be getting as many Eagle Scouts involved to support the council as leaders, and that means unit leaders, district leaders, council leaders, wherever leadership is needed. And I think if you harness what we used to call Eagle power, it can make quite a difference in a local council. So providing service to the council in the form of leadership is the number one thing we should be doing. And I didn't answer your question about the girls. It just occurred to me the military was very supportive of girls. I mean, both Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, and there was no concerns at all that I'm aware of about girls entering the advancement program of the Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
People tend to forget that we've had girls in scouting in Boy Scouting since the 1970s.
Yeah.
Girls were in exploring and some other programs that we've had, but they were not part of the advancement program. So the main difference is now they can belong to a Boy Scout troop and become an Eagle Scout, which is great. It's terrific.
Indeed, it is, and we're seeing lots of females do just that across the country, and hopefully in these overseas councils as well. We're coming to the end of our time, and always I ask the guests if you have an open microphone now to talk to the viewers with anything you'd like them to know about anything you'd like them to know. So I'll turn it over to you. How's that?
Okay, well, I think it's important to note that many Americans like me get their first taste of scouting overseas. And we're talking hundreds of thousands over the last 75 years or so. And we return to the United States. Most of us are sticking with scouting. We are in every council in America, and we're usually in the thick of things. I mean, look around, and if you start to ask people, you'll find a lot of people that have been in Transatlantic or Far East Council or Canal Zone Council or Alaska, whatever, and they're making a difference everywhere they go. But if we didn't have that opportunity overseas, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people might not have ever been in the Boy Scouts of America. That said, I mean, it was also wonderful to come back to the United States and get involved in many councils here. I think I've been in 10 councils, Oklahoma and Alabama, Georgia, elsewhere, Raleigh. And there's good scouting everywhere you go. But it's all good because if you stick to the aims and methods of scouting, you've got a standard and you've got the ability to have good and wholesome fun. I don't think it's as expensive as people tend to tell me all the time. I think I was doing a random survey of literature and what's out there, looking at the cost of the YMCA and other groups. Looking at the National Camping Association put out something about the average week-long camp is about $500 a week in the civilian world. The YMCA has their monthly fees, and if you're late picking up your child, you pay a fine. Stuff like that. I mean, it's just very different. I'm not saying they're better or worse than we are. It's just that for what you get with scouting compared to band or soccer or whatever other activities, it's really not that expensive. I think it can be expensive. We can make it more expensive. One of my pet peeves is I get, which is kind of ironic, being a retired sergeant major and a captain. People that are civilians that have never been in the military are fixated on uniforms and the patch police and making sure your uniform is correct and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, there's a place for that. There's a learning experience, and uniforms have a role in identity and morale and so forth. But we're not a paramilitary group. We shouldn't be overly fixated on that.
Yeah.
And recently there was an advertisement for an event. I won't name it, but you were required to be in Scout uniform, and you can't require people to be in a Scout uniform. It's an optional thing. You can't force someone to wear a uniform. They will eventually, most people, but there are people who can't afford uniforms.
Yeah.
And it's great if you have a uniform closet, a lending closet, or whatever. And when I was a kid, the troop had its own little lending closet. As you outgrew your pants or whatever, which we did every week, you had a place you could try on something else and save a few dollars. Same thing with shirts and badges and whatever. We recycled stuff before recycling was cool. So I really think sometimes we get too far away as adults on the idea of having fun and the guided discovery and learning by example. And so rather than criticize somebody's uniform, which I'm glad to get away from mom and dad and not be criticized. I don't need you criticizing me.
Yeah.
I'd rather, you do the skit about Tenderfoot Todd, who's wearing his uniform, laugh about that, or show me two uniforms, one good and one bad, stand next to each other, and let me figure out, what's good or bad about this picture. Make it into some. Huh?
From my experience as a youth scout, the uniform didn't make any difference in what I got out of the program, the fun I had, and the
Right.
rich experience. So if people are fixated on uniforms, it's probably not going to be the folks at the youth level.
Right. And it's the same thing with the knots and all that. I mean, I'm wearing more knots than I normally do, but I don't wear all my knots. Geez, if I wore all my knots, they'd be all the way back here. I don't need to do that. I don't need to impress somebody. I wear the ones that I think are important. I have different shirts for different things. So I'll wear my Cub knots on a Cub uniform, but I'll wear them on this one. And I'll wear the top awards on this one because I want people to see somebody with the top awards is still doing something.
Yeah.
That's the only reason I wear them, because otherwise it's just too much status and ego, and that's not what we're all about.
Yeah. When things get shaky in scouting, I like to go back to the basics. We're here to help support the growth, learning, and development of youth. And if we continue to go back to that basic reason to be, the ship will continue to sail pretty stably. Can I get you to commit to coming back and joining us in the future to talk a little bit more about NISA specific in the future?
Sure, I'd like to do that because there's a lot of work that needs to be done with NISA, a lot of misconceptions, and I think a lot of people out there that I've spoken to are trying to figure out how to make their NISA committee effective. And same thing with Scout executives. A lot don't see any value to NISA because they haven't seen it done properly in terms of support to the council.
Well, I'd be eager to extend the conversation to NISA specific in the future. Hey, I want to thank you very much for your time. All the best to you. And folks, we'll see you next in an upcoming episode of Eagle Scouts Worldviews. Bye now.